For anyone who's interested in my evolution of race consciousness, please check out the poem that I wrote, Contraband of Race War, and the animation I commissioned to go along with it. It's on my YouTube channel. But Ali, I want to know about you. What is your evolution of race consciousness?
Yeah, so I was born in Louisiana. My dad is Palestinian, raised in Lebanon, migrated to America in the late 70s. And my mom is Irish American from Pittsburgh, raised Catholic, and then converted to Islam and married my dad. And so I was born in Louisiana, where my dad was going to school, and spent the first 10 years of my life until like 92 when we moved to Chicago. And I remember a couple of things happened when I lived in Louisiana because I'm biracial, and so growing up, I'm not quite white. I'm not black, but I'm kind of other. And one of the first memory I actually have, I remember being in school, and this was in probably the first or second grade, and a teacher came into my classroom. The teacher was white, and one of the black students was upset with something she was saying. We were being loud or something, and our teacher wasn't there, and she told us to be quiet. And as she's leaving, the student yells out to her and calls her a honky. And she hears it, but is outside of the room, makes a point to come back into the room, and then looks at the student and says, "Yeah, I'm a honky and proud." And this was a grown woman saying this to a first or second grade student. And I'm watching this, and I'm realizing that there's something not right about this picture. And I think it was the first time that I realized that there was a racial hierarchy, because that teacher, or that white teacher, was a teacher and in power. And certainly, I suppose, the tables could have been flipped, but that's what I saw, and that's when I began to realize that there was this hierarchy, this racial hierarchy. I remember my father, and that didn't happen to me, but my father told me a story, and he told me a story when he was working some job in Louisiana, and one day he said a child, like one of a child of one of his coworkers. This was a factory, I think, was there, and this child was black. And the child sees his manager, and the child begins to yell "Klan." And my dad, who's an immigrant, doesn't understand what that means. Well, what is this kid talking about? And so the manager takes my father, this is my father telling me the story, takes him into his office, opens up a cabinet, and shows my father his Klan hood. And I knew also that there was a racial hierarchy because, so my father, who is a brown man and Palestinian, is very dark skinned. If his features weren't Middle Eastern, he could pass as African American maybe. And yet this manager saw it perfectly fine to show my father his Klan hood. And I imagine as a child that if he was black, that would not be happening. And that, in fact, there is a racial hierarchy, and even amongst, within that hierarchy, those who consider themselves at the top also look at people of different races differently, in kind of maintaining that hierarchy. Because then I knew that they really hated Black people, and I wasn't amongst them, amongst those who they hated. Maybe, I don't know, or where did I stand? I don't know. So that was my first kind of exposure as a child to racial hierarchy.
So that's pretty. That's pretty interesting, because one thing that I think I want to highlight about what you said is that perception, right, in the race context. You could tell that you were not perceived the same as Black people through these experiences, and you could tell that Black people were perceived, or at least there was this delineation between Black people and white people, but also, even though you knew and you had an internal understanding that you weren't racialized as Black, you also had an understanding that you weren't racialized as white, but you got a chance to see that perception can allow racialized white people to see you as not a threat if you don't fall within the category of black through their perception on the
Yeah.
racial hierarchy.
Yeah, no, exactly. And this is also this is pre 9/11 also. And so yeah, it was a big wake up call to me that that hierarchy existed, that I fell in somewhere along that hierarchy. Um, and I think that those experiences kind of informed also how I look at like race relations in America, because I, as a brown man, as a minority race, and someone from a minority ethnic group, um, I realized early on though that just because I fall into a minority category doesn't mean that I am having the same life experiences as other minorities, particularly Black Americans. So and then I think what's important, what in my kind of like the evolution of my consciousness of this racial hierarchy. So when I was 10 years old in the early 90s, we moved from Louisiana to Chicago. And that was the first time that I experienced personally racism directed towards me. My family and I moved into a suburb of Chicago called Stickney, which is literally just on the border, maybe across the street, and you're in Chicago. So, for all intents and purposes, it looks like Chicago, it feels like Chicago. And we moved into a predominantly white Polish neighborhood. And turned out that the neighbors who lived next door to us, we were renting a home, were neo-Nazis. They called my brother and myself sand niggers. And it was the first time I didn't even know what that term meant. I had never heard it. Called us ragheads or towelheads. And those were terms that I hadn't ever heard before. And so within the first week of moving to Chicago as a 12-year-old child, I had never experienced racism before like that. I had witnessed things, but not that kind of like anger and hatred towards me or my family because of where I came from or my lineage. And that put a real spin on my perspective of the racial hierarchy, because I didn't expect to experience that in Chicago. I assumed, living in Louisiana and witnessing racism predominantly from white people towards Black people, that was a thing open in the South, open in Louisiana. And then within the first week, I was proven wrong. And I think so that also showed me that number one, there are perhaps not myths, but there are perceptions of reality that are not always accurate about the hierarchy of race, the racial hierarchies and where they're located. And I was living in the South, and in my mind, the South was a kind of a place where that happened more openly. And then I moved to Chicago and this happened. And I was shocked, and it really challenged my perception of the racial hierarchies, and it began to change as soon as I moved to Chicago.
You know, the one thing that I think about when I hear that story is that you had this experience, and yeah, it was sobering, but for you, what it meant was that you needed to change your perception or your beliefs about the racial hierarchy. And you immediately, it sounds like, went along with kind of readjusting to the new reality that you had experienced. But what I find is that in this race context, that process is extremely difficult for many people who are presented with facts about the racial hierarchy or historical facts that go against what they had learned about the history of the country or something like that. Do you think that it was your personal experience, the fact that it was directed at you, at your family, that allowed you to change? Or do you think that you would have changed even if you observed it from afar?
I think I would have changed even if I observed it from afar. I think that so growing up as a biracial child, right? I lived in two different worlds. I am biracial, so I do live in two different worlds when it comes to my racial identity and my ethnic identity. And I think that there's a certain openness that I learned to have as a child. And so, and I've tried to carry that with me into my adulthood, which is just being curious and being open to the idea that my perceptions are perhaps only my perceptions and not actually reality. And so I think that had I observed that, I mean, I observed that student in the class and his interaction with the white teacher. I heard the story from my father, and all of that began to change my perspective. So I think had I witnessed it um, and not experienced it myself when I came to Chicago, I think it still would have it had the same effect on me.
Okay, good.
And this is not to mention, this is we're just talking about like my perception of racial hierarchies. This isn't to mention like the kind of trauma that bigotry that I experienced had on me, and how I needed to adjust myself to survive in a world that placed me in a certain racial hierarchy, even if it was only amongst certain people and not everyone. These are my next door neighbors. I had to see them regularly, and I had to protect myself because they would they wouldn't come into my yard, but they would throw stuff at my brother and I, and they would attack us from across their fence, and I had to adjust.
Yeah, really good point there about safety, right? And the impact that these racial incidents can have on your actual safety and your perception of being safe and not, right? Like, and I think a lot of people have trouble understanding that racism finds you, right? Like racism is not like is. I actually get messages from people on social media all the time who say, "Oh, you're looking for race. You're looking for race everywhere, and if you look for it, you're going to find it." They don't really understand that, like you were just moving, with your family into a house, and boom, racism finds you right next door, and all of a sudden you're like a sand N word, and people are throwing stuff at you and you're like, wait, what? Like, I was just like existing, and like now I'm in this situation. A lot of people don't get that that's how racism operates. It's not like you need to go looking for it, it finds you, and then you are forced to adjust in a system, in a country, in a world that lives by a racial hierarchy whereby you don't have power to really fight back. So it can be very psychologically and spiritually damaging, and even if you do learn to protect yourself, a lot of the defense mechanisms or protections actually have a negative impact on you, the individual. So you almost get like a double whammy: the racism and the defense.
Yeah, it is a double whammy because I mean, racism isn't just an intellectual exercise, right? It's not just an intellectual state of being. It manifests physically, and it manifests in violence usually. And so being somebody who was targeted because of my race and because of my ethnicity, I had to deal with fear of walking down the block, that these kids might find me or my brother and attack us. And there was more than one occasion when they did chase us and we did run. Um, but yeah, it completely shifted my reality, and what I had to do to protect myself and those around me.
Okay, so you're living this new reality where your neighbors are neo Nazis. Wake up call. And then you are kind of coming to terms with having to like kind of be on guard, in your own home and like in and around your own home and neighborhood. So your perception of race and racism, some of your past illusory beliefs about it being concentrated just in the South or mostly in the South or something like that, are kind of falling away. What was your next step in your evolution, would you say?
So I had an interesting experience because um, when I moved to Chicago, I attended a private Islamic school, like a middle school and high school. And even though I lived in this neighborhood, this town, Stickney, we would drive like half an hour to another suburb for this school. And in this suburb, in the southwest suburbs of Chicago, there's a very large Middle Eastern and Palestinian community. And so, um, one for my experience, I entered into a brand new world that was very different than the world I had grown up in as a 12-year-old. And so my experience was that I quickly realized that within this very large and active, predominantly Muslim Palestinian community, I wasn't Palestinian or Arab enough. I didn't speak Arabic. I pronounce my name as Ali because I was raised in Louisiana. That's what my mom calls me till today. I call myself Ali. And I was challenged on the pronunciation of my name. I didn't know a lot of the cultural norms mostly because my mom is white American, and a lot of my culture growing up, even though I am Palestinian, I was raised Muslim. A lot of my cultural norms and behaviors are from my mom. And so I feel very generically American in a lot of ways in terms of my culture. So going to this community in Chicago, I realized yet again that I am different. And I developed some insecurity around um, and fear of not being accepted into that community, who are in fact people who identify, or at least half of how I identify from an ethnic and racial perspective. And so I think that within that enclave of Arab and Palestinian folks who lived in the southwest side of Chicago, I began to realize that there's even racial hierarchies within ethnic groups. And just because you belong to a certain ethnic group or a certain racial group does not mean that all of a sudden there are not racial hierarchies, because there certainly were and are racial hierarchies that I experienced in that community. And so that was like another, and I was isolated for a while because I spent most of my time in that community and in that school. So the majority of people who I had intimate relationships with and friends and adults who were teachers or aunts or uncles, kind of aunt uncle status, were all part of this community. So for those 6 years, most of my interactions were within that community. And so most of my experience was me struggling to yet again fit in and to be accepted within that group as well.
Yeah, this is like I would say, prototypical story that I hear from people who are multiracial or biracial, part of different worlds, that, they don't feel fully accepted by any single group. And so they find themselves bouncing around. Interestingly enough, many Black people I talk to, and myself included, have had the same experience, even though we are clearly racialized Black. But Black people would look upon us as being like, Oreos, as they say, white on the inside, black on the outside, right? Like, as like not being Black enough, even though,
Yeah.
clearly we're Black. So, yeah, and
It's because of how they perceive you based upon your behavior, or perhaps how you speak, or the words you use, or the things you don't do, or the things you do, right? And so yeah, I relate to that a lot, because it causes a very different kind of internal struggle, at least it did for me. And that's really of like wanting to be accepted, but always knowing that I'm not really the same because they don't see me the same. And so there's always a struggle to want to be accepted.
you have this experience, you go through all of these different experiences, your racial perspective and lens is expanding and becoming more thorough. Um, do you feel like ever since that last moment where you kind of were in the Muslim community, the Arab community, and felt some kind of rejection, like, um, was there anything further that you would say kind of helped you either come to terms with your place in the racial hierarchy and like how you were existing, or do you feel like anything happened beyond that where your racial understanding evolved even greater from where you were there?
Yeah. So like to kind of back up a little bit. So like there's another layer to my experience, and the layer to my experience, and the other layer to my experience is that I am Palestinian. So growing up as a Palestinian, um, part of my heritage that I inherited was the historical and spiritual and emotional and psychological trauma that is the occupation. And so growing up, and this relates to racial hierarchy because my grandfather's land was stolen by what is the Jews of Israel. It wasn't Israel before, in 1948. And so growing up, the story I grew up with was that um, the Palestinian people, my people, were seen as subpar, not only to Israelis, to Jews in Israel, but even amongst the other Arabs as well. Because after World War I, World War II, when a lot of the Middle Eastern countries began to gain independence, most of them at some point gained independence, all save Palestine and Palestinians, right? And we still see what's happening today in Gaza as a direct result of that. So that racial hierarchy for me was always that the Palestinians, my people, are poor, downtrodden, and somewhat helpless, had our land stolen from us. And there is this other people who took it from us, and those in power support them and don't support us. And so that was also something that, and I had to really struggle with that intergenerational trauma from my father, who had a very victim mentality. And that victim mentality, it was not just about religion, because you have Palestinians of many different religions, but I think it's very much at the heart of it about race. And majority of Palestinians they are Palestinians. They're Arab. They are brown. They are not white European, for instance. And so, or at least not white appearing for the most part. So yeah, so there's that layer as well. I think that the evolution of the racial hierarchies continued in college. So when I went to college, the second uprising in Palestine happened. It was round about the same time as 9/11. And that changed a lot. 9/11 changed a lot. I was a student at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, an undergrad, uh, during 9/11. And I remember being scared to come back to Chicago because the country was filled with American flags. Um, they were everywhere. The mosque that I went to in the southwest suburbs of Chicago, there was some kind of a march that was planned to go against the mosque. And in fact, there were police and law enforcement that were posted outside the mosque for several weeks, round the clock after 9/11. And I remember coming to the mosque after a couple of weeks after it happened, and seeing law enforcement in like full tactical gear, faces covered, semi-automatic weapons, ARs, and just feeling really vulnerable and feeling like, okay, so now Muslim Americans and Arab Americans have like plummeted in the racial hierarchies. And so, and for a long time, or as I perceived, enemy number one, or number two, or whichever enemy it was, but higher up on the list. So 9/11 changed a lot. The second uprising, the second intifada that happened in Palestine was important to me because I was very active on campus. And I began to see some racial hierarchies on campus with those who supported, let's say, Israel, and those who supported Palestine, um, and the struggle that those who supported Palestine endured, because to be someone who supports Palestinians and who supports Palestinian independence, um, you don't have, or I don't have, or those who are pro-Palestinian don't have powerful support necessarily. That's it. And they don't have money behind it, behind that movement. So I always experienced some sense of helplessness, um, even though I was still doing the work, and I continue to do the work, and I continue to protest, and I continue to have my voice heard. Um, it was hard to really battle that sense of helplessness. And so yeah, so I think that was a big chapter in how I saw racial hierarchies, because all those events just reinforce the idea that those hierarchies exist, that they are maintained in society, and they're maintained by structures of power.
Yeah, well said. The work that you did with an organization, traveling overseas to the Middle East, to the region where the conflict is, in and around the region where the conflict is going on, and you were working with an organization. That's part of the reason I wanted to invite you here, is talk a little bit about your travels, talk a little bit about the organization you worked with and your experience, and kind of some of the parallels that you may have seen, or even differences that you may have observed in terms of othering and dehumanization and racism, with Palestinians and Israelis.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is so I'm happy to talk about it. So um the a little bit about the program. So the program is it's a very unique program. Um and it's a program by an institution in Israel called the Shalom Hartman Foundation, or the Shalom Hartman Institute. The Shalom Hartman Institute is, as a matter of fact, an Israeli organization, and part of its mission is to really propagate the continued existence of the state of Israel. So a lot of what they do, but it's an academic institution. So a lot of what they do is research. They hire scholars to do studies. They do a lot of writing. And they have a couple of programs. They actually have multiple programs where they teach people, and they teach groups of people about Israel, Judaism, Zionism, and they do this for rabbis, predominantly in the US. So it's a program where they'll take rabbis from the US, bring them to Israel for 2 weeks, go through kind of like a crash course in all that they have to offer about Israel and Zionism and Judaism. And then they bring them back for another 2 weeks a year later. And in the meantime, they kind of like have some stateside activities and events and kind of like symposiums that they go to. So they start a similar program for Christian ministers. Eventually, at the request of a Turkish imam, who's a chaplain at a university here, he reached out to them and said, why don't you do the same program but for Muslim Americans? So they started a program where they took usually about maybe 15 to 20, maybe more, I think 30 may be the max, Muslim Americans, some academics, many professionals, and they take them to Israel, and they learn about what it means to be Jewish, what it means to be an Israeli, what does Zionism mean for Jews and for Israelis. And as part of the program, they spend about 2 days out of like the 9 days going to the West Bank and interacting with Palestinians. So the program is really meant to teach Muslim Americans about what Israel and Zionist Judaism means for Israelis and Jews, but also they want to also show the participants the reality of the occupation. So although the program itself is not about, specifically learning about Palestinians, it is included within the program. And so we spend time in the West Bank interacting with Palestinians and going and visiting certain sites in certain cities like Bethlehem or Hebron. And so we do that, and we do it twice. So the experience was interesting because I was the first Palestinian to actually complete the program. Majority of the Muslim Americans, actually all of them up until me, had not been Palestinian American. They had been Muslim American of some other ethnic origin. The program also, you should know, is quite controversial within the Muslim community, the Arab community, and within the Jewish community. There's a lot of mistrust on both sides, a lot of mistrust of the intentions of why Shalom Hartman runs this kind of a program, what they're hoping to achieve by bringing Muslim Americans in this program to Israel, and also what the Muslim Americans who are participating in this program hope to achieve. And there are many who support the Palestinian cause who are not in favor of this program because it goes against the boycott, divest, and sanction movement. For myself, I was curious. I'm always curious. I want to engage in conversation with Israelis, with Jews about Israel and Palestine, and I want to do it with an open mind. And so this program for me, even though in college I was leading protests and leading sit-ins for the second Intifada right before 9/11, I was also at the same time very willing and interested in learning the other side. So some of the takeaways here I want to kind of highlight for me in terms of like the evolution of my consciousness around racial hierarchies was number one, the power and privilege that Israelis have compared to Palestinians. I think objectively, many of us will look and say, well, of course, it's obvious, right? Israel is a nation state. It is backed by the United States militarily, economically. It is backed by other countries as well. And the Palestinians don't have that anywhere near that kind of power, all right? But to actually sit in a room with scholars who were sharing their personal experiences, majority of whom served in the army and some of whom saw combat, and I made assumptions at the time that some of them probably killed Palestinians in combat. And so receiving that information as a Palestinian, I felt very vulnerable. And so as a result, I just took it in. I didn't want to engage, mostly out of wanting to protect myself emotionally. And I remember one of the first classes we had was a class on the history of Zionism. And there was one of the professors there who was teaching us this class, and he was born and raised in Israel, and he's talking about Zionism, and he's talking about what Zionism did for his family, that Zionism, which led to the creation of Israel, helped his family escape turmoil and escape racism against them as Jews in Europe. And he's talking about this with a smile on his face. And I can see the sincerity behind it. I can see what the state of Israel did for him and his family. But at the same time, right, I had a lot of mixed emotions about receiving that as a Palestinian, right? To be able to see a movement that's done so much for me and my family, and yet completely destroyed other people to achieve that dream, um, it objectively, it's very hard to understand how a human being can accept that. And to talk about the history of Zionism as such a good thing, and not really talk about, unless questioned, the impact it had on others. And um, and the others are just less than. And so that was a abundantly clear to me that despite engaging in conversation, which I still am happy to do and I love doing, it's why I'm here as well, there is a racial hierarchy. There is a power indifference. And that power indifference can really affect those conversations. And so that was like the first shocking thing to me of when I was in these and it was a lot of classroom study. We had some like field trips. We went out, we saw other places, but a lot of it was just learning. And so that was really hard, but also really eye-opening that, yes, I had grown up with my dad kind of talking about being a victim and having this victim mentality, but then I got to actually see and experience those in power who he references when he talks about those who took his land or his father's land and kicked them out and killed Palestinians. And even that was hard to sit down and have a conversation civilly, knowing that there is this power indifference, that there is this racial hierarchy, and that I am at the bottom of that racial hierarchy as far as that conversation goes. It's humbling, and it also caused a perspective shift. And the perspective shift was that it caused me to think a little bit more deeply about having conversations about race, essentially, because that's what I believe the Palestinian and Israeli conflict is essentially about. It's about race. It's about ethnicity, right? It's about bloodlines and rights over land based on that race or based on those bloodlines, right? That conflict is a racial conflict at its heart. And so I also realized that it wasn't just a Palestinian-Israeli thing. It's also it's a racial issue. So that was, and I had other experiences I want to share also. I'll kind of maybe push pause for a minute, but I also had interesting experiences in the West Bank with Israeli soldiers that I can share as well. But that classroom experience really was the most enlightening for me, though, because I was having these conversations with people and listening and hearing their stories and really taking it in.
Wow, what an incredible kind of opportunity for growth, even though it was difficult for you and like you really had to like dig deep emotionally to get through that. I just think there's no substitute for hearing from people who are close to the source of these conflicts. NBA basketball, right? And people be like, oh, LeBron, X, Y, and Z, and Dame, and this and that, and Curry, and blah, blah, blah. And we have all these deep, in-depth conversations about people we've never met, people we don't know, the dynamics of a league that we don't understand, and pretend like these people are something that we are, like we're buddy-buddy with them, and we know their entire life story and what they're going through and what their existence is like. But the closer and closer you get, right? The people who have access to the locker room for part of their job or work directly with players or in the back office or is in a relationship with somebody related to the NBA, right? The closer and closer you get to the central elements of the inner workings of these contexts, the more it's revealed that it's not really possible for you to have a thorough understanding of what's going on from a distance. And so I think that's what it made me think about when you were telling me about, like, yeah, you have your dad and him giving the stories of what happened and you're able to observe his mindset based on that. But going there directly, right? Going closer and closer to the geographic location where all this took place, where the legacy of what happened to your dad and his dad is still going on. That's like palpable, right? And that is it makes it more real.
Yeah.
And one thing that we talk about here on the show all the time, and that a lot of people who come on report, is that they only started recognizing the virulence of white supremacy, the power of white supremacy, and the negative consequence of white supremacy by coming into community with Black people, like geographically, relationship wise, experiencing life with them. But from a distance, they always report that it was too difficult for them to perceive the racism that was endemic in the society. So, yeah, what a valuable experience for you. I definitely am interested in hearing about your experiences with the IDF soldiers. If you'd like to share those, I'd love to hear.
Yeah, yeah. So, well, I'll speak about them in general. So, I've been to Israel and Palestine 4 times, and two times I went on my own before I did this program. And so, some of the things that stick out for me are, just I'll tell you, and this is probably like the first realization that I was going to be singled out because of how I looked and where I was from, because I'm Palestinian. When I went there the very first time, I was interrogated for 4 hours and then rejected at the border and sent away and not allowed to enter. And I was coming in from Jordan. I was studying Arabic there, but they didn't give me any explanation. And they asked all kinds of questions. And then I decided to go again a few months later, and this time from a different border crossing. And the second time around, they interrogated me for about 8 hours. And that's very traumatic. Like I did not grow up having experiences with, or I didn't really have negative, experiences with law enforcement. And again, and I know as a side note, that speaks to racial hierarchies here within America, that I, as a minority brown man, did not experience those things. Whereas Black Americans experience interactions with law enforcement in negative ways all the time, every day. And so for me to have to be just interrogated as a 20-year-old, 21-year-old, was really jarring. When I finally got to like the guy who eventually let me in, he said, it was interesting. He said to me, "So a few months ago, you went to the other border crossing and they told you the border crossing was closed and to come back the next day. Why didn't you?" And I was like, I became very angry. I said, "That's a lie." And they lied in their report. I said, "They never told me that." He said, "What happened?" I said, "They interrogated me just like you did, and then handed me and my buddies the passports back and said, 'Sorry, you can't come to Israel, leave.'" He said, "Just like that?" I said, "Yeah." And you know what? I He believed me. I could tell he believed me because he saw that I was angry, and he got on the phone and hung up 2 seconds later and said, "Give me my passport," and said, "All right, welcome to Israel." And so, that right there just it showed me that for them, I didn't even exist. For them, I didn't matter. For them, and by them, I mean Israelis, I was someone less than. And even though I'm an American citizen with an American passport, I'm still Palestinian. And it didn't matter that I had an American passport. It didn't matter that it just didn't. They would discriminate against whoever they wanted to, predominantly Palestinians. And so that was my first experience within Israel. Um, and then when we this was interesting. In when I was in I think the first 2 weeks trip that I took with this group, with the Shalom Hartman Institute, we went to the West Bank and we went to Hebron. Now, Hebron, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Hebron, but Hebron is, it's a hotbed for conflict within the West Bank. So Hebron in Arabic, in English, the name is Hebron. In Arabic, it is Khalil. Okay, and the significance of Hebron is that That is where Muslims and Jews believe that Abraham is buried. Okay, Prophet Abraham, and some of his family as well. So there's a mosque, or there's a structure built around the tomb. On one side, it's turned into a synagogue for Jews to go and worship, and on the other side, which is really an upstairs other side, is a mosque. And Hebron, which is a predominantly Palestinian town, it's a city, has a settlement, a Jewish Israeli settlement, right in the middle of the town that is next to the grave of Abraham. And I was told a number before that there was approximately like 400 settlers. This was back in the early 2000s. And there were about 4,000 Israeli Defense Force soldiers stationed in Hebron to protect those 400. And if you went downtown to Hebron, which is where the settlement is and where the mosque and the synagogue is around the grave, it's like a ghost town because the Palestinians just moved out of that area entirely. And so I've been to Hebron maybe 2 or 3 times. And the time that I was with the group, we were taking a tour. And if you look up pictures of Hebron, you'll see that to get in and out of certain places within Hebron, you have to go through a military checkpoint, and there are turnstiles. So as we're walking through the turnstiles, my entire group, remember, this is about maybe 20 or so very outwardly appearing Muslims, women wearing headscarves, men maybe with beards, looking very much like a group of Muslims, but looking kind of diverse. Every one of us goes through, and I'm the only one pulled aside. So as we are walking through, they pull aside and they just start questioning me. What are you doing here? I'm with the group over there. Where, what? And they start asking me specific questions, because what they're trying to do is they're trying to get me to trip up if I'm lying. But they clearly singled me out because I appear Palestinian. Then they don't believe me when I say I don't speak Arabic because I wasn't raised with Arabic. And I tell them that my mother is American, I was raised in America, and like many Americans, I only speak English, despite having heritage with a different language in my heritage. And on that same trip, we had a tour guide who, as we were walking through the turnstiles, and it's a really crappy thing to do, apart from the trauma of just like stopping somebody. They stop him. They don't stop him on the slide like they did with me. He's passing through the turnstile, and they stop and lock the turnstile. And he had to stand in the turnstile space for about 20 minutes to half an hour in that space where he couldn't move. He couldn't take a step one way or the other. He couldn't sit down. And there's no end in sight. When will you be let go? Whenever the IDF soldier wants to let you go, right? For no apparent reason, because it's clear that he looks Palestinian. There were, if you go into the downtown of Hebron, there's open air markets, and Israeli Jewish settlers began to move in, but we're going to call it what it is, which is to occupy and to steal properties on the they're like apartments, and to steal the ones that are on top. So a Palestinian family will live on a floor below, and an Israeli Jewish family will live on the floor above. And when you walk through those open air markets, you will notice that there are cages and gates right on top of the open air market. And I said, why are they here? And you see trash on them. Because the Israeli settlers will throw shit, and excuse my language, throw trash at the Palestinians, and actually sometimes literal feces. And they put that gate up, that cage on top, so that at the very least, even if it was liquid, it would get through. But if it was something heavy like rocks, which they have, and that can hurt people, with no consequence, and a continued adherence to a moral principle of their right to be there, and their own that they created. And so it's very abundantly clear when you go into, especially when you go into the West Bank, and especially when you go into a place like Hebron, which is different than other cities in the West Bank because you have the Israeli settlement right there in the heart of that city. And so yeah, it's very, very tense. It is not a place that I enjoy being in for those reasons. And it was very clear that one of the realizations I came to, and I've had this realization before in childhood, was that had I not been born in America, had I been born there, that very well could have been my life. Had I been born in Lebanon, where my dad was, where the Palestinians till this day have not been made citizens of Lebanon. It's I think, an established kind of rule of international law that if you accept refugees into your country, if you don't make them citizens, at least the children who are born in it will become citizens of that state, just like here in America. But for Lebanon, they did not do that. So I think that not just growing up Palestinian and then having these experiences, it really solidified that there is a racial hierarchy, and part of the peace, what I'm going to call the peace process, which I don't really think exists at the moment, is that racial hierarchy. So you have power behind it, an imbalance of power, but not just an imbalance of power. You have at least one side, and maybe even both sides now, because of the hatred from the oppression and the occupation. You have both sides looking at one another as less than. But one has that power, and one has used that power to create a state and deny sovereignty and liberty to another people based on that racial hierarchy. So yeah, it was a pretty jarring to go through all of that, and even to be in Palestine as a Palestinian American and experience those things for the first time.
I really appreciate you sharing your reflections from that journey. I mean, this is so important for people to hear and understand first of all, the parallels to a lot of what we see in the United States to what you saw. And also, the kind of governmental control that was that's so transparently, and military control that's like openly exerted on the Palestinian population over there. I think it's, I don't think that people in America think that that's something that we're close to, but we're like a stone's throw away from that. Like literally, like it could manifest very easily here, and it has in the past in this country. I think a lot of times racialized white people think that as black people who talk about race, we're like preaching or something, right? Or we're like something like that. But it's not really like that. I think a lot of people, and maybe this is something I need to talk about more on the show just to make people understand, but my understanding of a racialized white person's experience under the racial hierarchy has expanded greatly as well. It's not a one-way street where like white people need to learn about black people. Like I've learned an extensive amount about people racialized as white and how they deal with the racial hierarchy. And it's radically different from the way that people who are racialized as black deal with it. And that makes perfect sense because that's how the hierarchy was designed. It was quite literally designed to give us different experiences of our life, and so it makes sense, but like ultimately, a lot of people, they can't rationalize it because they've been taught not to. They've been taught not to think about what the consequences of the establishment of a racial hierarchy, where you say that some people are less human than others. Like those consequences, especially when it's perpetuated over generations, they're infinite. It's not something that can be measured. That's why it drives me nuts with a lot of these statisticians or economists or people out here who are like, well, the statistics say this, and I'm like, bro, if you are trying to use statistics to quantify racism, I think that is it's an insane, fraught endeavor. We don't even have the mathematics necessary to manage to do that. As a math teacher and mathematician myself, I can confidently say that. And so it's unfortunate because a lot of people kind of worship numbers and like think, I had one student who was a senior in high school. We were talking because he was called a racist. He was a racialized white male called a racist in the middle of one of his classes. And he was talking to me about that experience and, how he felt about it and whatnot. He was matriculating to MIT the next year, studying math. And he goes to me, he's talking about some statistical study about race, and he rattles off this percentage. And I was like, okay, but like, it's your interpretation of the percentage that is an issue. Like, I'm not devaluing the percentage or anything, but like, it's what you think that percentage means that's like an issue. And I kind of gave him an example of my own experience, right? And his statement from that was, well, isn't your experience baked into the number? That's what he said. Isn't your experience baked into the number? And that's what people are being taught, is that if you see a number, a statistic that someone calculated, that is representative of everyone's experiences in that context. I don't know how somebody who's going to MIT studying math could ever come to that conclusion or believe it, but if someone at that high level is thinking like that, what is everyone else thinking, And since we have no formal education on this stuff, there's no formal education on race or racism. In fact, many states have laws against such an education at this point. So, that's where we're at now. And, speaking of feeling vulnerable, right, in a position of differential power, me realizing that, coming to terms with that, understanding that I'm going to be fighting against this gargantuan power that includes governments, that includes many individuals, conscious and unconscious of the fact that they're empowering it. That is is there any more vulnerable position, right? To set yourself at odds with that. And so, yeah, when I first created the Contraband Wagon, I really had to reflect on that for some years, actually. Thinking about how far I was willing to go, what am I willing to sacrifice? And, ultimately, I was able to find the courage and do it. And 3 years later, here we are talking with you. And I'm really glad that I made the choice, and I wouldn't go back for anything. And that's something that I hear a lot of people say, despite whether their experience is positive or negative, when they decide to dig into the subject of race and racism and educate themselves and put themselves in uncomfortable positions and ask difficult questions and be told that they might be a little bit racist and all of these things, almost exclusively everyone who experienced these things comes out and upon reflection decides that it was a positive thing for them in their life.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's very difficult for people before they engage in that to imagine such an eventuality, because there's so many negative messages out there about engaging in the conversation.
Yeah, and I think that the messages about having these conversations that are out there, and the kind of domestication that we go through as people, where we kind of are raised in our own bubbles, we're raised in our own communities, in our own families, and we're raised to believe certain things and think a certain way. I think that there's a lot of fear to having these conversations. And I think that deep down, the fear is, what happens if the beliefs I have are challenged, and what happens if I begin to doubt them? Will I no longer be part of the group, right? What will that mean about me if I start to question or doubt my own beliefs, right? And that's very scary for anybody. But I can attest to exactly what you were talking about, though. Like, doing that program in Israel, as hard as it was to be a Palestinian man, to sit through and learn about Israel and Zionism from the perspective of the powerful, from an Israeli Jewish Zionist perspective. while it was difficult, it was very rewarding for me because of the insights it gave me. Um, and, growing up as a Palestinian, even though um, the Israelis are the oppressor, I mean, I don't really like to even get into conversations about whether or not that's true or not. I think it should be abundantly and objectively clear that the people of Gaza who have just been slaughtered, and their homes destroyed, their civilization destroyed, um, that they are not the oppressors, and that there is a power imbalance there. I think, though, that nonetheless, growing up Palestinian, I still saw Israelis as other. And what the program I did, what it did for me was to also put a human face on Israelis. And it didn't change my perspective of who has more power or who doesn't. Didn't change my perspective on the fact that I do believe that at the heart of that conflict and at the heart of the occupation is a racial hierarchy. But it allowed me to see others as human beings and to understand their lived experiences, which helps me grow as a person and helps me to expand. And that's really invaluable.